how medieval people celebrated Christmas. Picture this. It's December 25th, 1347. You're standing in the great hall of a medieval castle, shivering despite the massive fire crackling in the hearth. The air is thick with smoke, the smell of roasted meat, and something that might charitably be called festive cheer. But this isn't the Christmas you know. There are no twinkling lights, no carefully wrapped presents under a perfectly trimmed tree. There's no Santa Claus, no Christmas carols playing softly in the background, and definitely no last-minute shopping panic. Instead, you're witnessing something far rawer, far stranger, and infinitely more chaotic. Welcome to a medieval Christmas where celebration meant survival, where religion mixed with pagan rituals older than memory, and where the line between sacred and profane was as blurry as the ale-soaked vision of the village drunk. Medieval Christmas wasn't a single day of gentle family gathering. It was a season of endurance, a 12-day marathon of feasting, fighting, and trying not to die from either the cold or the excess. It began on Christmas Day and stretched all the way to Epiphany on January 6th. 12 days of what could only be described as organized chaos, where normal rules didn't apply and the social order turned upside down like a cart full of turnips hitting a pothole. But let's start at the beginning. Christmas in medieval Europe wasn't originally about Jesus. Not entirely, anyway. The December 25th celebration was grafted onto older, darker traditions that had been warming the hearts and livers of Northern Europeans for centuries. The Romans had their Saturnalia, a week-long festival where masters served slaves, gambling was encouraged, and public drunkenness was not just acceptable, but expected. The Germanic tribes celebrated Yule, a feast honoring the return of the sun during the darkest time of year. And scattered throughout Europe, various pagan festivals marked the winter solstice with rituals involving fire, food, and the desperate hope that spring would eventually return. When Christianity spread across Europe, the Church faced a problem. These winter celebrations were deeply rooted in the culture, woven into the fabric of daily life. You couldn't just tell people to stop celebrating. That would be like telling a fish to stop swimming, or a politician to stop lying. Impossible, and ultimately pointless. So the Church did what it did best. It adapted. It took the existing festivals and gave them a Christian veneer. December 25th became the official birthday of Jesus Christ, not because anyone knew when he was actually born, but because it was convenient. The pagan celebrations continued, but now they had a respectable Christian excuse. The result was a holiday that was equal parts holy and profane, sacred and savage. Medieval Christmas was Christianity with its hair down and its sleeves rolled up, ready to party like it was $9.99. And party they did, because for most medieval people, Christmas was the one time of year when you could eat meat, drink wine, and forget about the grinding poverty and brutal hardship that defined the rest of their existence. But before we dive into the feast, let's talk about the fasting. Because medieval Christmas began with what might be the most masochistic tradition in human history: Advent. 4 weeks of preparation that made modern dieting look like a casual suggestion. Starting on the 4th Sunday before Christmas, medieval Christians entered a period of strict fasting. No meat, no dairy, no eggs, no fun. Just bread, vegetables, and the gnawing certainty that somewhere, somehow, someone was enjoying themselves more than you were. Advent wasn't just about denying yourself food. It was about denying yourself everything that made life bearable. No weddings, no dancing, no music, no laughter. Just prayer, contemplation, and the kind of grim determination that only comes from knowing that Christmas dinner was waiting at the end of the tunnel. The theory was that by depriving yourself of earthly pleasures, you would be more spiritually prepared to celebrate the birth of Christ. The reality was that by Christmas Day, people were so desperate for meat and merriment that they would have celebrated the birth of anyone who promised them a decent meal. The fasting made the feasting more intense. After 4 weeks of eating like a particularly ascetic monk, even the simplest Christmas meal felt like a banquet fit for kings. And for those who could afford it, the actual Christmas banquet was something that would make modern holiday dinners look like a light snack. We're talking about meals that lasted for hours, featured dozens of courses, and required the services of small armies of servants, cooks, and entertainers. The Christmas feast was the centerpiece of medieval celebration, but it wasn't the gentle family gathering we might imagine. It was a public spectacle, a demonstration of wealth and power, and a ritualized form of organized gluttony. The wealthy didn't just eat, they performed eating. They turned consumption into art, excess into entertainment, and hunger into a distant memory. The meal began with the wassailing, a tradition that sounds festive until you realize it involved large groups of people wandering from house to house, demanding food and drink while singing songs that were equal parts blessing and threat. The wassailers would arrive at your door carrying a bowl of spiced ale or cider, and they would sing songs wishing you health and prosperity. But the subtext was clear. Give us food and drink, or we'll wish you considerably less health and prosperity. It was caroling with an edge, Christmas spirit with a side of mild extortion. Once the wassailers had been fed and sent on their way, the real feast could begin. And what a feast it was. The tables groaned under the weight of food that had been prepared for days, sometimes weeks in advance. Roasted beef, pork, mutton, and venison. Geese, chickens, ducks, and swans. Fish prepared in dozens of different ways. Pies filled with meat, fruits, and spices. Puddings, both sweet and savory. Cheese, bread, and ale in quantities that would make a modern brewery weep with envy. But the star of the medieval Christmas feast was the boar's head. This wasn't just food, this was theater. The boar's head was carried into the hall on a silver platter, garnished with bay leaves and apples, while musicians played and servants sang. The presentation of the boar's head was a ceremony that combined dinner and drama, turning a dead pig into a symbol of abundance, courage, and the triumph of civilization over the wild forces of nature. The symbolism was important. The boar was a dangerous animal, fierce and unpredictable. Killing one required skill, courage, and a certain degree of madness. By eating the boar's head, the medieval Christmas celebrants were symbolically consuming these qualities, taking the beast's strength and courage into themselves. It was communion with a pagan twist, Christianity flavored with older, bloodier traditions. The feast wasn't just about the food, it was about the experience. Medieval Christmas dinners were multimedia events that combined eating, drinking, music, dancing, and entertainment. Professional entertainers called minstrels would perform between courses, singing songs, telling stories, and performing acrobatic feats that would make modern circus performers nervous. Jesters would mock the powerful and entertain the masses with humor that walked the fine line between acceptable and treasonous. And throughout it all, the ale and wine flowed like water, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions until the great hall became a swirling mass of human chaos. The entertainment wasn't confined to professionals. Medieval Christmas was a time when normal social rules were suspended, and everyone was expected to participate in the revelry. Lords would serve their servants, masters would obey their apprentices, and the entire social hierarchy would be turned upside down in a ritual reversal that was part celebration, part social safety valve, and part controlled rebellion. This tradition of role reversal had ancient roots. The Romans had done it during Saturnalia, and the medieval Christians adopted it as part of their Christmas celebration. They called it the Feast of Fools, and it was exactly what it sounds like. For one day, sometimes longer, society would flip upside down. The lowest would become the highest, the humble would rule the proud, and chaos would reign supreme. The Feast of Fools was more than just fun and games. It was a crucial part of medieval social structure, a pressure release valve that allowed people to vent their frustrations with the established order without actually challenging it. By making the reversal temporary and ritualized, the authorities could allow people to experience power without threatening the real power structure. It was revolution as entertainment, rebellion as celebration. But the celebration wasn't confined to the castle or the manor house. Every level of medieval society had its own way of celebrating Christmas, and the common people were no less enthusiastic than their noble betters. In the villages and towns, Christmas meant freedom from work, escape from the grinding routine of daily survival, and the chance to eat meat and drink ale without being called lazy or sinful. Village Christmas celebrations were rowdy affairs that combined Christian ritual with pagan tradition and a healthy dose of pure chaos. The celebrations began with midnight mass on Christmas Eve, a service that was supposed to be solemn and sacred, but often devolved into something more resembling a festival than a worship service. The churches were packed with people who had been drinking since sundown, and the combination of religious ecstasy and alcoholic enthusiasm created an atmosphere that was both holy and wild. After Mass, the real celebration began. The villagers would gather in the churchyard or the village common, and the party would continue until dawn. There was dancing, singing, drinking, and what the medieval chroniclers diplomatically called various forms of merriment. The dancing was particularly enthusiastic, with men and women joining hands in great circles that spun around fires, creating a scene that looked more pagan than Christian. The village celebrations included traditions that would seem bizarre to modern eyes. There was the tradition of the Christmas log, a massive piece of wood that was dragged to the village center and burned throughout the 12 days of Christmas. The log was supposed to bring good luck and prosperity to the community, but it also provided a focal point for the celebration, a place where people could gather to drink, dance, and escape from the cold and darkness of winter. There was also the tradition of mumming, a form of folk theater that involved groups of villagers dressing up in masks and costumes and performing plays that told the story of death and resurrection. The plays were crude and often incomprehensible, but they served an important function. They allowed people to confront their fears of death and darkness while celebrating the promise of rebirth and renewal. The mumming plays were deeply rooted in pre-Christian tradition, but they were adapted to fit Christian themes. The central character was often a hero who died and was brought back to life, a clear reference to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But the plays also included characters from pagan mythology, fertility symbols, and jokes that would make a modern comedian blush. They were Christianity and paganism mixed together in a stew that was both sacred and profane. The village celebrations also included the tradition of the Lord of Misrule, a temporary king who ruled over the Christmas festivities. The Lord of Misrule was usually chosen from among the common people, and for the duration of his reign, he had absolute authority over the celebration. He could command anyone to do anything, as long as it was in the spirit of Christmas merriment. The position was both an honor and a burden, because while the Lord of Misrule had power, he also had responsibility for ensuring that the celebration was memorable, entertaining, and properly chaotic. The Lord of Misrule tradition was another example of medieval society's complex relationship with authority. By giving temporary power to someone from the lower classes, the community could experience what it would be like if the social order were different, while still maintaining the understanding that the reversal was temporary and ritualized. It was a safety valve that allowed people to blow off steam without actually challenging the established order. But not everyone appreciated the chaos of medieval Christmas. The church, despite having created the holiday, was often deeply uncomfortable with the way it was celebrated. The combination of Christian ritual and pagan tradition created a festival that was difficult to control, and the authorities were constantly trying to impose order on what was essentially a celebration of disorder. The church's attempts to control Christmas celebration were largely unsuccessful. People had been celebrating the winter solstice for thousands of years, and they weren't about to stop just because some bishops disapproved of their methods. The result was a constant tension between official Christian doctrine and actual Christian practice, between what the church wanted Christmas to be and what it actually was. The clergy found themselves in the awkward position of trying to promote a holiday that regularly got out of hand. They would preach about the sacred nature of Christmas, while their parishioners were planning wassailing expeditions and Lord of Misrule elections. They would urge moderation and sobriety, while presiding over celebrations that were notable for their complete lack of both. It was like trying to promote responsible drinking at a brewery tour. The tension between sacred and profane reached its peak during the 12 days of Christmas. This wasn't just a long holiday. It was a sustained period of celebration that tested the limits of human endurance and social order. Each day had its own traditions, its own rituals, its own particular forms of madness. The first day, Christmas Day itself, was relatively restrained. The morning was devoted to religious services, and the afternoon was occupied with the great feast. But as the days progressed, the celebrations became more elaborate and more chaotic. By the end of the 12 days, society had been turned upside down so many times that no one was quite sure which way was up. The final day, Epiphany, was known as Twelfth Night, and it was the climax of the entire celebration. Twelfth Night was when the Lord of Misrule's reign ended, when the normal social order was restored, and when the community said goodbye to the Christmas season. But before that happened, there was one last explosion of celebration, one final night of revelry that would make the previous 11 days look like a quiet evening at home. Twelfth Night celebrations included the tradition of the Twelfth Night cake, a special pastry that contained a bean or a coin. Whoever found the bean or coin in their slice became the king or queen of the bean, and they ruled over the final night of celebration. It was a last chance for role reversal, a final opportunity for the common people to experience power before returning to their normal lives. The tradition of the Twelfth Night cake was more than just a game. It was a ritual that reinforced the temporary nature of the Christmas celebrations. By making the final ruler a matter of chance, the community emphasized that the power reversals of Christmas were not meant to be permanent. They were part of the celebration, not a challenge to the established order. But perhaps the most important aspect of medieval Christmas was its function as a survival mechanism. For people living in a world without central heating, without adequate food storage, without any of the comforts we take for granted, winter was a season of genuine hardship. Christmas provided a psychological and social break from the struggle for survival, a chance to forget about the cold, the hunger, and the uncertainty of daily life. The Christmas celebrations also served an important economic function. The great feasts redistributed wealth from the rich to the poor, as nobles were expected to provide food and entertainment for their dependents. The wassailing tradition ensured that even the poorest members of society received some share of the Christmas bounty. And the gift-giving, while not as elaborate as modern Christmas presents, provided a way for people to share what little they had with their neighbors and friends. The economic aspect of Christmas was particularly important in a society where most people lived on the edge of subsistence. The Christmas feast might be the only time all year when a peasant family ate meat, drank wine, or had enough food to feel truly satisfied. It was a crucial source of calories and nutrients that helped people survive the worst part of winter. The gift-giving tradition in medieval Christmas was quite different from modern practice. Gifts were usually simple items: food, clothing, small tools, or handmade crafts. The wealthy might give money to their servants or tenants, while the poor might give each other items they had made during the long winter evenings. The emphasis was on the thought and effort behind the gift, not its monetary value. Children received gifts, but they were typically practical items rather than toys. A new pair of shoes, a warm cloak, or a small tool might be treasured possessions that would make life easier in the coming year. Toys, when they existed, were simple wooden items or dolls made from scraps of cloth. The modern concept of childhood as a separate stage of life with its own needs and desires was largely unknown in medieval society. The religious aspect of Christmas was never far from the surface, even during the wildest celebrations. The Christmas story was told and retold through plays, songs, and sermons. The nativity scene, while not yet the elaborate display we know today, was represented in churches and sometimes in homes. The story of Jesus' birth provided a framework for the celebration, a sacred narrative that gave meaning to the revelry. But the religious observance of Christmas was deeply intertwined with older traditions. The Christmas tree, which wouldn't become popular until much later, was preceded by the Yule log and various forms of evergreen decoration. Holly, ivy, and mistletoe were brought into homes and churches, partly for their beauty, but also for their symbolic significance. These plants stayed green throughout the winter, representing the persistence of life during the dark season. The use of evergreen decorations in Christmas celebration was a perfect example of how medieval Christianity absorbed and transformed pagan traditions. The evergreens had been sacred to pre-Christian religions, symbols of life's triumph over death, of hope's persistence in the face of despair. By incorporating them into Christian celebration, the Church was able to honor both the new faith and the old wisdom. The Christmas season also included traditions that would be considered bizarre by modern standards. There was the tradition of the Christmas pie, a massive pastry that might contain dozens of different kinds of meat and game. The pie was so large that it often had to be baked in specially constructed ovens, and it was designed to feed dozens of people. Breaking open the Christmas pie was a ceremony in itself, a moment of anticipation and excitement that marked the beginning of the feast. There was also the tradition of the Christmas pudding, although it bore little resemblance to modern versions. Medieval Christmas pudding was a savory dish made from meat, vegetables, and spices, steamed in a cloth bag and served hot. It was hearty, filling, and designed to stick to your ribs during the cold winter months. The sweet Christmas pudding we know today didn't develop until much later. The beverages of medieval Christmas were as important as the food. Ale and wine were consumed in quantities that would alarm modern doctors, but they served important functions beyond simple intoxication. In an era when water was often unsafe to drink, fermented beverages provided a safer alternative. The alcohol content killed harmful bacteria, and the brewing process often involved boiling, which further purified the liquid. The Christmas beverages were also heavily spiced, both for flavor and for their supposed medicinal properties. Mulled wine, spiced ale, and various forms of punch were believed to have healing properties, to ward off disease, and to provide strength during the difficult winter months. The spices were expensive, imported from distant lands, and their use in Christmas beverages was a sign of both wealth and celebration. The wassail bowl, carried by the wassailers from house to house, was a particularly important Christmas beverage. The wassail was a mixture of ale or cider, spices, and sometimes eggs, heated until it was steaming hot. The bowl itself was often an elaborate piece of craftsmanship, passed down through generations and brought out only for special occasions. The wassail ceremony was both a blessing and a demand, a way of ensuring that the Christmas spirit was shared throughout the community. The music of medieval Christmas was as diverse as the celebration itself. Sacred carols told the story of Jesus' birth, while the secular songs celebrated the joys of food, drink, and companionship. The carols were often performed by groups of singers who went from house to house, spreading the Christmas message and collecting food and drink for their efforts. The medieval carols were quite different from modern versions. They were often more narrative, telling complete stories rather than simply expressing emotions. They included details about the nativity that don't appear in the biblical accounts, folk traditions that had been absorbed into the Christian story. The carols were also more participatory, designed to be sung by groups of people rather than performed by professional musicians. The musical instruments of medieval Christmas were similarly diverse. Churches had organs, of course, but the secular celebrations included a wide variety of instruments. Drums, pipes, harps, and various stringed instruments provided the accompaniment for dancing and singing. The music was often loud and energetic, designed to be heard over the noise of celebration and to inspire people to join in the festivities. The dancing that accompanied medieval Christmas music was enthusiastic and sometimes scandalous. The church generally disapproved of dancing, viewing it as a source of temptation and sin. But during Christmas, the usual restrictions were relaxed, and people danced with abandon. The dances were often circle dances, with men and women holding hands and moving in complex patterns around the fire or through the streets. The clothing worn during medieval Christmas celebrations was as elaborate as people could afford. The wealthy dressed in their finest robes, richly decorated with fur, silk, and jewels. The poor wore their best clothes, often saved specifically for special occasions. The contrast between rich and poor was stark, but during Christmas there was an expectation that everyone would dress as well as possible, that the celebration deserved special effort. The colors associated with medieval Christmas were different from modern traditions. Red and green were present, but they weren't as dominant as they would become later. Gold was particularly important, representing the wealth and glory of the Christ child. Purple was also significant, representing royalty and majesty. The colors were rich and deep, reflecting the wealth and importance of the celebration. The decorations of medieval Christmas were more subtle than modern versions. There were no electric lights, no plastic ornaments, no mass-produced decorations. Instead, people used natural materials, evergreen branches, berries, flowers, and fruits. The decorations were handmade and often had symbolic significance. A wreath of holly might represent the crown of thorns, while ivy might symbolize eternal life. The homes and churches were decorated with tapestries, banners, and other textile hangings. These were often especially made for Christmas, featuring religious scenes or festive motifs. The textiles provided color and warmth, transforming cold stone buildings into welcoming spaces for celebration. The games and entertainment of medieval Christmas were as varied as the people who participated. There were games of chance, games of skill, and games of strength. Dice games were popular, despite the church's disapproval of gambling. Wrestling matches, archery contests, and other forms of athletic competition provided entertainment and settled disputes about who was the strongest or most skilled. The entertainment also included more elaborate forms of performance. Mystery plays, which dramatized biblical stories, were performed in churches and town squares. These plays were often crude and sometimes irreverent, but they served an important educational function, teaching biblical stories to people who couldn't read. The plays were interactive, with the audience participating in the performance, cheering the heroes and booing the villains. The storytelling tradition was particularly important during the long winter evenings of Christmas. Professional storytellers would recite epic tales of adventure, romance, and heroism. These stories were passed down through generations, changing and evolving with each telling. They provided entertainment, education, and a connection to the past. The ghost stories that are now associated with Christmas have their roots in medieval tradition. The long, dark nights of winter were perfect for tales of the supernatural, and Christmas was a time when the boundary between the natural and supernatural world was believed to be particularly thin. Stories of ghosts, spirits, and miraculous appearances were common, adding an element of mystery and wonder to the celebration. The charitable aspect of medieval Christmas was significant, though it was often motivated as much by social obligation as by Christian charity. The wealthy were expected to provide for the poor during Christmas, and this expectation was enforced by both social pressure and religious teaching. The Christmas feast was shared with servants, tenants, and neighbors, creating a sense of community that transcended normal social boundaries. The poor, for their part, were expected to show gratitude and deference to their betters. The Christmas charity was not given freely, but was part of a complex web of social obligations that reinforced the existing power structure while providing some relief for those at the bottom of society. The tradition of Christmas charity extended beyond simple food and drink. The wealthy might provide clothing for the poor, fuel for their fires, or money for their most pressing needs. The Church encouraged these acts of charity, seeing them as a way of earning divine favor and demonstrating Christian virtue. The legal system also recognized the special nature of Christmas. Courts were often closed during the 12 days of Christmas, and prisoners might be released or have their sentences reduced. The Christmas season was seen as a time of mercy and forgiveness, when the normal rules of justice might be tempered with compassion. The agricultural cycle was closely tied to Christmas celebrations. The Christmas feast marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of the period when farming communities had to survive on stored food. The celebration was both a thanksgiving for the harvest and a hope for survival through the winter months. The slaughter of animals for the Christmas feast was timed to coincide with the onset of cold weather, which helped preserve the meat. The great quantities of meat consumed during Christmas were not just about abundance, but about practical necessity. The meat had to be eaten before it spoiled, and the Christmas feast was an efficient way of sharing it throughout the community. The brewing of special Christmas beverages also followed the agricultural calendar. The grain needed for ale and the fruits needed for wine were harvested in the fall, and the fermentation process was timed to be ready for Christmas. The brewing of Christmas ale was a community activity, with neighbors helping each other and sharing the results. The international aspect of medieval Christmas was limited but significant. The spices used in Christmas cooking came from distant lands, carried by merchants along dangerous trade routes. The silken jewels worn by the wealthy were imported from Asia and Africa. The Christmas celebration was a rare opportunity for ordinary people to experience products from around the world. The pilgrimage tradition was also connected to Christmas. Many Christians made pilgrimages to the Holy Land or to other sacred sites during the Christmas season. These pilgrimages were dangerous and expensive, but they provided a way of connecting with the sacred geography of Christianity. The returning pilgrims brought back stories, relics, and new traditions that enriched the Christmas celebration. The influence of different cultures on Christmas celebration was evident in the variety of traditions practiced across Europe. The Christmas celebrations in England were different from those in France, which were different from those in Germany. Each region added its own customs, its own foods, its own forms of entertainment to the basic Christian framework. The weather played a crucial role in shaping medieval Christmas traditions. The celebration was designed to provide warmth, light and cheer during the darkest and coldest time of year. The great fires, the rich food, the energetic dancing, and the warm clothing were all responses to the harsh realities of winter life. The Christmas celebration was also a way of marking time in a world where calendars were rare and most people couldn't read. The 12 days of Christmas provided a framework for organizing time, a way of counting down to the new year and the gradual return of spring. The end of the Christmas season was marked by the return to normal life, but the memories of the celebration sustained people through the long winter months. The Christmas feast provided calories and nutrients that helped people survive until spring, while the social connections made during the celebration strengthened the bonds that held communities together. The power dynamics of medieval Christmas were complex and fascinating. The temporary reversals of social order weren't just fun and games. They were carefully controlled experiments in social engineering. By allowing the powerless to experience power, even briefly, the ruling classes could gauge the mood of their subjects, identify potential troublemakers, and provide just enough release to prevent actual rebellion. The Lord of Misrule, despite his temporary authority, was always chosen carefully. He was usually someone who could be trusted to keep the chaos within acceptable bounds, someone who understood that his power was borrowed and temporary. The position required a delicate balance of leadership and restraint, the ability to orchestrate mayhem without letting it spiral into genuine revolution. The servants, who suddenly found themselves being waited upon by their masters, knew exactly how far they could push their temporary advantage. They might demand better food or mock their betters' pretensions, but they rarely used their brief power to settle serious grievances or challenge the fundamental structure of society. It was revolution as theater, rebellion as release valve. The Church's relationship with these traditions was endlessly complicated. On one hand, the bishops and priests preached about the spiritual significance of Christmas, the sacred nature of Christ's birth, the importance of prayer and contemplation. On the other hand, they found themselves presiding over celebrations that included drinking contests, bawdy songs, and rituals that were barely disguised pagan ceremonies. Some clergy embraced the chaos, seeing it as a necessary part of human nature that needed to be accommodated rather than suppressed. Others fought against it, delivering sermons about the dangers of excess and the importance of spiritual discipline. Most found themselves somewhere in the middle, trying to maintain some semblance of religious authority while acknowledging that their parishioners were going to celebrate whether the church approved or not. The Christmas sermons of medieval priests were often exercises in creative interpretation. They would take the biblical account of Jesus' birth and expand it into elaborate narratives that included local customs, seasonal traditions, and convenient explanations for why drinking and feasting were actually forms of religious observance. The shepherds in the fields became an excuse to discuss the importance of community. The Star of Bethlehem became a justification for elaborate light displays. The visit of the wise men became a reason to exchange gifts and share wealth. The regional variations in Christmas celebration were enormous. In Northern Europe, where winters were particularly harsh, the celebrations were more intense and lasted longer. The Norse traditions of Yule brought elements of fire worship and animal sacrifice that were gradually absorbed into Christian ritual. The great Yule log wasn't just a decoration. It was a sacred fire that was believed to protect the community from evil spirits and ensure the return of spring. In Southern Europe, where the climate was milder, the celebrations were more elaborate but less desperate. The Italian Christmas traditions included elaborate nativity scenes, processions through the streets, and performances of miracle plays. The Spanish celebrations incorporated elements of Moorish culture, with exotic spices, intricate decorations, and musical traditions that reflected the complex cultural heritage of the Iberian Peninsula. The French Christmas traditions were particularly theatrical. with elaborate court celebrations that featured professional entertainers, elaborate costumes, and performances that lasted for days. The French nobility competed to host the most extravagant Christmas celebrations, turning the holiday into a display of wealth and power that impressed visitors from across Europe. The German Christmas traditions were perhaps the most influential in terms of their long-term impact. The Germans developed many of the customs that would eventually become standard across Europe and beyond. The Christmas market, the Christmas tree, the Christmas cookie, and the Christmas carol all had their origins in German Christmas traditions. The economic impact of medieval Christmas was enormous. The preparation for Christmas began months in advance, with servants working overtime to prepare food, clean houses, and create decorations. The demand for luxury goods increased dramatically, benefiting merchants, craftsmen, and traders. The Christmas season was often the most profitable time of year for many businesses. The agricultural communities organized their entire year around the Christmas celebration. The timing of harvests, the slaughter of animals, the brewing of beverages, and the preparation of preserved foods were all calculated to ensure that the Christmas feast would be as abundant as possible. The Christmas celebration was both a reward for the year's hard work and a crucial part of the economic cycle. The Christmas markets that sprang up in towns and cities were temporary economic ecosystems that brought together merchants, craftsmen, and customers from across the region. These markets sold everything from spices and silk to handmade toys and religious artifacts. The markets were social events as much as economic ones, places where people could meet, gossip, and participate in the larger community. The gift-giving tradition, while not as elaborate as modern Christmas, still had significant economic implications. The wealthy were expected to give generously to their dependents, and this expectation could be financially burdensome. Some noble families went into debt to maintain their Christmas obligations, borrowing money to ensure that their celebrations met social expectations. The Christmas tip, or Christmas box, was an established tradition that required masters to give money to their servants. This wasn't optional generosity, but a required payment that servants counted on to supplement their meager wages. The failure to provide adequate Christmas boxes could result in servants leaving or spreading gossip about their master's stinginess. The food traditions of medieval Christmas were incredibly diverse and often bizarre by modern standards. The Christmas pie, for example, might contain dozens of different kinds of meat, each layer representing a different course of the meal. The pie was a work of art as much as a food item, with elaborate decorations and symbolic elements that told the story of the Christmas celebration. The Christmas pudding was originally a savory dish that bore little resemblance to modern versions. It was made with meat, vegetables, and spices, wrapped in cloth and boiled for hours. The pudding was dense, filling, and designed to provide maximum nutrition during the cold winter months. The sweet Christmas pudding we know today didn't develop until much later, when sugar became more widely available. The Christmas cake was another elaborate creation that required weeks of preparation. The cake was made with dried fruits, nuts, and spices that had to be imported from distant lands. The preparation of the cake was a community activity, with neighbors helping each other and sharing ingredients. The cake was often made in November and allowed to age until Christmas, developing complex flavors and becoming increasingly alcoholic as it soaked up wine and brandy. The Christmas beverages were as important as the food. The wassail bowl was the centerpiece of many celebrations, a communal vessel that was passed from person to person, symbolizing the sharing of Christmas spirit. The wassail recipe varied from region to region, but it always included alcohol, spices, and often eggs or cream. The bowl itself was often a treasured family heirloom, passed down through generations and brought out only for special occasions. The mulled wine tradition was particularly popular in wine-producing regions. The wine was heated with spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, creating a warming beverage that was perfect for cold winter evenings. The spices were expensive and exotic, making mulled wine a luxury that was associated with wealth and celebration. The Christmas ale was a special brew that was made specifically for the holiday season. The ale was stronger than everyday beer, with more alcohol and more complex flavors. The brewing process often began in early autumn, allowing the ale to ferment and develop its character in time for Christmas. The Christmas ale was a source of pride for brewing communities, with different households competing to create the most impressive batch. The role of women in medieval Christmas was both central and constrained. Women were responsible for much of the preparation that made Christmas possible. They cooked the elaborate meals, brewed the special beverages, created the decorations, and managed the household logistics that allowed the celebration to happen. Yet, they were often excluded from the public aspects of the celebration, relegated to serving roles while men took center stage. The Christmas season was one of the few times when women could exercise some degree of social power. The lady of the manor might be expected to oversee the celebration, making decisions about entertainment, food, and gifts. The village wise woman might be consulted about traditional recipes or herbal remedies. The wealthy merchant's wife might use Christmas as an opportunity to display her taste and sophistication. The Christmas celebrations also provided opportunities for women to socialize and form connections that transcended normal social boundaries. The shared work of preparation, the communal nature of the celebration, and the temporary suspension of normal rules created spaces where women could interact more freely than usual. The children's experience of medieval Christmas was quite different from modern celebrations. Children were expected to participate in the adult celebrations rather than having separate child-focused activities. They might receive small gifts, but these were usually practical items rather than toys. The emphasis was on including children in the community celebration rather than creating a separate childhood world. The Christmas traditions that specifically involved children were often educational or moralistic. The Christmas pageants and mystery plays were designed to teach children about Christian doctrine. The Christmas carols often included moral lessons about generosity, obedience, and faith. The Christmas stories were used to transmit cultural values and social expectations. The children's gifts were typically handmade items that reflected the skills and resources of their families. A wooden toy carved by a father, a doll made by a mother, or a piece of clothing sewn by an older sister were treasured possessions that served both practical and emotional functions. The gifts were often intended to last for years, becoming cherished keepsakes that connected children to their families and their traditions. The Christmas celebrations also marked important transitions in children's lives. The Christmas season was often when children were formally introduced to adult responsibilities, when they were given their first real jobs, or when they were expected to contribute to the family's work. The celebration was a rite of passage that marked their growing maturity and their increasing integration into adult society. The artistic traditions of medieval Christmas were rich and varied. The Christmas carols were often complex musical compositions that required skilled performers. The carols told stories, conveyed emotions, and created shared experiences that bound communities together. The melodies were often based on ancient folk songs, but the lyrics were adapted to reflect Christian themes and contemporary concerns. The Christmas decorations were works of art in their own right. The handmade ornaments, the carved figures, the woven hangings, and the elaborate table settings were all created with skill and care. The decorations were often reused year after year, becoming part of the family's heritage and connecting each Christmas to the celebrations of previous generations. The Christmas pageants and mystery plays were elaborate theatrical productions that required months of preparation. The costumes were carefully designed and constructed, often using expensive materials and intricate details. The sets were built specifically for the performances, creating elaborate backdrops that transported audiences to biblical times. The performances were community events that brought together actors, musicians, and craftsmen in collaborative artistic endeavors. The Christmas illuminated manuscripts were perhaps the most sophisticated artistic productions of the medieval period. These hand-copied and decorated books contained the texts of Christmas services, carols, and stories. The illuminations were incredibly detailed, featuring gold leaf, bright colors, and intricate designs that took skilled artists months to complete. These manuscripts were treasured possessions that were passed down through generations of wealthy families. The legacy of medieval Christmas extends far beyond the Middle Ages. Many of our modern Christmas traditions can be traced back to medieval practices. The Christmas tree, the Christmas carol, the Christmas feast, and the Christmas gift all have their roots in medieval celebration. Even the commercial aspects of modern Christmas, with their emphasis on consumption and display, echo the medieval understanding of Christmas as a time of abundance and generosity. The medieval Christmas established patterns of celebration that have proved remarkably durable. The combination of religious observance and secular celebration, the emphasis on family and community, the traditions of gift-giving and feasting, and the use of special foods, decorations, and entertainment all originated in medieval practice. These traditions have been adapted and modified over the centuries, but their basic structure remains recognizably medieval. The social functions of medieval Christmas have also proved enduring. The holiday continues to serve as a time for social bonding, for the expression of generosity, for the reinforcement of community values, and for the creation of shared memories. The Christmas celebration remains a powerful force for social cohesion, bringing together people who might otherwise have little contact with each other. The economic impact of medieval Christmas also established patterns that continue today. The Christmas season remains the most important time of year for many businesses, the time when annual profits are made or lost. The tradition of Christmas shopping, Christmas bonuses, and Christmas charity all have their roots in medieval practice. The Christmas economy continues to redistribute wealth, create employment, and stimulate economic activity. But perhaps the most important legacy of medieval Christmas is its demonstration of humanity's need for celebration, for community, for hope in the face of hardship. The medieval Christmas celebration was not just about religious observance or social obligation. It was about the fundamental human need to gather together, to share what little we have, to create light in the darkness, and to believe that better times are coming. The medieval Christmas reminds us that celebration is not a luxury, but a necessity, not a frivolity, but a survival strategy. In a world that was often harsh, cruel, and unpredictable, the Christmas celebration provided an anchor of hope, a reminder that life was worth living, that community was possible, and that even in the darkest times, there was reason to celebrate. The medieval approach to Christmas also teaches us about the importance of ritual and tradition in human life. The elaborate preparations, the complex ceremonies, the carefully preserved customs all served to create meaning and structure in lives that were often chaotic and uncertain. The Christmas traditions provided a framework for understanding time, for marking the passage of seasons, and for connecting individuals to their communities and their past. The medieval Christmas also demonstrates the power of adaptive tradition. The way that Christian celebration absorbed and transformed pagan customs shows how cultures can evolve while maintaining their essential character. The medieval Christmas was neither purely Christian nor purely pagan, but a new synthesis that drew strength from both traditions. And so, as we stand in that medieval great hall, watching the boar's head being carried in procession, listening to the minstrels sing, and breathing in the smoke and chaos of a medieval Christmas, we're not just observing a historical curiosity, we're witnessing one of humanity's most enduring traditions, a celebration that has survived wars, plagues, social upheavals, and the rise and fall of empires. We're seeing the roots of our own Christmas traditions, the ancient foundation upon which our modern celebrations are built. The medieval Christmas was messy, chaotic, and often dangerous. But it was also joyful, communal, and deeply human. It was a celebration that brought people together, that provided hope in dark times, and that reminded everyone, from the highest noble to the lowliest peasant, that they were part of something larger than themselves. In a world that often seemed dark and hopeless, Christmas was a beacon of light, a promise that dawn would come, and a reminder that even in the midst of winter, life would find a way to celebrate itself. That, perhaps, is the true spirit of medieval Christmas, a spirit that continues to inspire our own celebrations today. Not the presents or the decorations, not the food or the entertainment, but the fundamental human impulse to gather together, to share our lives with others, and to create moments of joy and wonder in the midst of an often difficult world. That's the gift that medieval Christmas gives us, a reminder that celebration is not just about what we do, but about who we are and who we choose to be when the world seems darkest and hope seems furthest away.